So let's start off by talking about the Mind Flayers. This has been
Sure.
a D&D staple for a long time. We've seen them, references to them in Stranger Things as well. But the Mind Flayers are like one of the most insidious enemies in all of D&D. Is that correct?
They are pretty insidious. They are sort of from beyond. They don't kind of live in the worlds of D&D. They are invaders of the worlds of D&D, and they settle into dark places like the Underdark and subterranean realms and things like that because they don't really like the sun. In fact, they're kind of anti-sun. They go out of their way on some worlds to try to put out the sun if they can get away with it. And their method of propagation is somewhat off-putting to most other societies because they don't breed in a typical way.
Right. They're the tadpoles.
Yes, they implant tadpoles in humanoid hosts, and those tadpoles, over a short period of time, transform the humanoids into new mind flayers. That process is deliciously called seromorphosis.
Which is a wonderful word.
Yes, and when mind flayers are not sticking tadpoles in your brain, they are sucking your brain out through your skull as nourishment.
And they even have like jars of brains.
It's always good to have a stocked pantry.
It's good advice. It's good advice. And on top of all of this, they had a very far-reaching empire at one point.
Yes.
In all of the multiverse.
Yes, an empire that stretched across the stars, and they would, subjugate other creatures and keep them as thralls, and even performed experiments on them, in some cases transforming entire societies. Duergar have suffered under mind flayers, Kuo-toa have suffered under mind flayers, and of course, most notoriously, the Gith races, the Githyanki and the Githzerai, who eventually rose up in revolt and shattered that empire.
They are all a collective. They are genius. They are run by an elder brain on top of everything else.
Multiple elder brains.
Right.
Every colony of mind flayers basically centers itself around an elder brain and has sort of a telepathic link to all of the mind flayers in that colony. And so their individual intelligences are sort of combined and centralized through a hub. And that's, of course, very dangerous when you have so many geniuses conspiring toward one common goal. Without that elder brain, mind flayers tend to rely on their own genius, and that can lead to conflict.
Why did they get wiped out? Like, why did the empire fall?
Hubris. I mean, they eventually just, got to the point where they picked the wrong fight. Their thralls rose up against them, and they kind of panicked and didn't know what to do. When Githyanki are running around with silver swords chopping off your friends' heads, you just run away.
Generally speaking, yeah, that's a good way to be. Yeah.
And the Githyanki formed and Githzerai together, when they were still kind of one people, had champions leading the way. It was a full-scale sort of galactic revolt, and the mind flayers were not accustomed to this kind of reaction. They had gotten away with so many bad things over the years. They just thought we'll keep this under control too, and it didn't work out that way.
What I've always deliciously loved about the Mind Flayers is the canon kept on growing and growing from the very beginning. Like,
yes.
First you had this very octopoid-looking, creature, but then like we have some really amazing monsters that come along with them. Like the Intellect Devourer is so weird and evocative.
Yeah, it's another, Intellect Devourer is another kind of aberration. It wasn't originally linked to the Mind Flayers. As you say, it sort of organically grew over time that the Mind Flayers actually create Intellect Devourers and use them as pets and spies because the delicious thing about an Intellect Devourer is when it finds a humanoid that it likes, it telepathically bombards or psychically bombards that humanoid so that their brain basically turns to mush. And then the Intellect Devourer teleports itself into the brain cavity of the humanoid and basically turns it into a walking puppet. So you might be an Intellect Devourer. I would never know because you're hiding out in Todd's skull.
Yeah.
And basically seeing through Todd's eyes and talking through Todd's mouth.
It's all accurate. No.
Yeah.
It's been a 7-year con.
Yes, yes. The only way I'd know is if I killed you, and then the Intellect Devourer would then sort of teleport out of your head and be like, aha, there you are.
I was right.
There you are, real Todd.
It's kind of another head of Vecna dilemma, right? Like, was I right? Was I wrong?
Yes,
Who
yes.
can say?
I just, in my home game, I just had an encounter recently where the characters discovered that their guide was an Intellect Devourer with a meat puppet.
I love Intellect Devourers. I hate encountering them because it is a kind of save or die situation for a relatively low CR creature.
Yes, they're very dangerous, yet small.
Yeah. Which makes you happy, I know.
I can relate.
Why do you think people are so obsessed with Mind Flayers? It was kind of one of the goofiest monsters originally, and it just kind of spread and spread and spread.
Maybe it was kind of goofy because maybe it looked a little derpy in the art or something. I don't know.
Yeah. In the art, it was a little...
I mean, they always freaked me out. You've got this sort of slimy, mucousy, tentacle-faced creature who feasts on brains. I've always thought they're kind of scary, but I think that they sort of have a primal quality to them, and the fact that they're so intelligent and yet so inscrutable. Mm-hmm. You know, there's no facial expression with a Mind Flayer. You can't really read what's going on there. They're completely alien. They're immoral. They have no compunctions about feeding on other sentient beings. In fact, they thrive on it. Sometimes they hold like dinner parties where they savor, different flavors of brains. It's just, they're so antithetical to normal existence. And they surround themselves with creepy friends, elder brains and Intellect Devourers and more. They also deprive you of agency and control,
Right, yeah. There's the loss of agency, the body horror of all of it, and then something that you cannot possibly understand.
Yes.
It's deeply alienating.
Yeah. There's that moment where first they mind blast you, so you're basically stunned and helpless, and then there's that creepy moment where they slink up behind you and slap their tentacles on your head so that they can basically suck your brain out.
That's the true horror, because in D&D, like, okay, I got hit by a fireball, or a dragon breathes a cone of cold on me and I die. I get that, but like, no, you're paralyzed for a round.
You're watching your own death.
Yeah,
and sort of unfold over a period of several seconds.
There's a lot of...
The last thing you hear is that horrible slurping noise.
Yeah, they're one of my favorite villains and one of the most terrifying. And what's the best way to run them? Because this comes up a lot. And, I've talked about this a lot. How do you run villains who are supposed to be arch geniuses?
Well, I mean, despite their brilliance, Mind Flayers are actually kind of frail individually. So they're not going to be at the front of a fighting force. They're going to be lurking in the back, or they're going to try to ambush you. When I've used them in the past in my campaign, they've sort of been infiltrating cities and things like that, and feeding on, the kind of dregs that nobody would mind, disappearing. But then they might just come floating out of an alley, basically mind blast you and drag you into the alley to suck your brain out. They're secretive and very sly that way. Or they try to lure creatures to them using, say, Intellect Devourers in the bodies of innocents. So you just sort of follow somebody, you don't know they're Intellect Devourer, but they're basically leading you into the Mind Flayer's clutches. The
nautiloids also are very evocative.
Yeah, if you want to go more sort of high fantasy with the Mind Flayers, you can basically put them aboard their ships. The way Mind Flayers travel through wild space and the astral sea is on these ships called nautiloids, which they're tentacled and very scary looking vessels. But you can basically have a run-in with one of those. If you're running a Spelljammer campaign and you see a nautiloid, that's usually a sign that you want to get out of there as quickly as possible.
Yeah, because they also have the tendency to teleport through space.
Yes,
so.
yes. If you've seen the Baldur's Gate 3 trailer, you've seen what a nautiloid can do and what it looks like. And I mean, you don't know how many Mind Flayers are aboard that thing, for one thing. The only thing worse than one Mind Flayer is 10 Mind Flayers.
It's true. And the Elder Brain itself is, it sits there amongst a brine pool, and there's tadpoles, but it is, if you thought the Mind Flayer was dangerous, the Elder Brain is a complete nightmare.
It is, yes, absolutely. It's big and scary.
And then we have another creature which I love that became associated with Mind Flayers is the Cranium Rats.
Oh, yeah. They sort of became very popular in the Planescape setting. And so Cranium Rats are basically rats with kind of protruding visible brains. And they can, in swarms, they become more intelligent. They basically augment one another's intelligence. So one Cranium Rat is not overly bright, but 10 Cranium Rats can probably beat you at chess pretty easily.
Which it's got like a Rats of Nim vibe to it. And
it does, yes.
One day I really want to have like the archvillain be a swarm of Cranium Rats.
I have done things like that before. It's very sort of Guillermo del Toro-esque, but having a swarm of Cranium Rats basically pretending to be a humanoid.
Yes.
Walking through alleys with like the coat over them. Just sort of shambling around.
I appreciate a good mimic reference.
Yes.
That sense of not knowing what you're facing, and there's quite a bit, like that's what all the Mind Flayer horror has always been like really exciting to me. And if you're playing Spelljammer, they're a terrifying thing, but there's a Dark City can be very close to also like kind of tapping into that Mind Flayer vibe. I felt like
Yes.
And then Stranger Things kind of like tapped into it because of like the incredible intelligence and the psychic connection to one of the kids and that stuff. And the tadpoles, of course, were very...
Yes, they're nasty.
The other thing, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, gnome squidlings. So typically, I'm bringing it up again.
Okay, yes.
Mind Flayers
absolutely.
almost always look like Mind Flayers when they transform something, but there is one goofy, and everything goes wrong with gnomes.
Right.
If they turn a gnome, there's a chance that gnome will become a gnome squidling. Or a gnome seramorph.
Yeah.
And then you've got these two very goofy threats.
Yeah, so with the adventure Rime of the Frost Maiden, we introduced that concept of sometimes seramorphosis, the process that transforms a humanoid into a Mind Flayer, does go wrong. And it often goes wrong with gnomes. For the reason that you've described, that there's just something quirky about gnomes. They've got some sort of perhaps innate magical misfitism that causes the process to go wrong. And what happens is you end up with a very short gnome-like Mind Flayer creature, or an almost sort of degenerate kind of Mind Flayer, shriveled, small, and emaciated. And they can be just as nasty as regular Mind Flayers, but more often than not, they retain a large chunk of their gnomish personality, which is not common. Usually once you transform into a Mind Flayer, whatever you were, there might be like a hint or a vestige of what you were still kind of lodged in that Mind Flayer psyche, but usually it's washed away by the process. Gnomes, however, can retain their gnomishness and their sort of personality quirks after undergoing seramorphosis.
And for Mind Flayers, when they eat brains, do they retain some of that memory?
It is known, it was sort of established in a second edition product called the Illithiad, that Mind Flayers, when they consume humanoid brains, they get sensations from that. It's part of the joy of eating the brain for them, is they experience fragmentary memories of the creature that they're eating. And in some cases, those memories can stick with the Mind Flayer for a long time. It's an interesting form. It's not a reliable form of getting information. That's why Mind Flayers can also read minds. But yeah, sometimes they can get impressions or knowledge from the creature that they basically feed on. And terrified brains are tastier than placid cow brains.
They taste people taste better when they're scared.
Yes.
That's a good takeaway from this video. Play D&D, kids.
Yeah. It's good for the soul.
If you liked this interview and you'd like to see more, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that little bell symbol so you're notified anytime a video like this comes out. Thank you so much for watching.